This week on The Other Side, the demonisation of men. Has Australia been living under a culture of putting down men for decades that's become so normalised that we don't even notice it anymore? ADH TV presenter and YouTube star Daisy Cousens will join me to discuss that. And we'll explore the differences between the way Gen Y and Z view things to how Gen X and Boomers do. Sectarian politics. Muslims in the UK have voted in the recent city council elections not on local issues, but as a united bloc on the issue of the Gaza war. Could this kind of thing get started here in Australia? We'll discuss how it already maybe has. And the cost of housing. How will we solve the housing crisis in Australia? And is it really a crisis or just another mainstream media beat-up? Leading economist Dr. Cameron Murray says the problem only affects around 5 to 10% of us, and he reckons he's got a solution that'll satisfy everyone. G'day Perth, g'day Darwin, g'day Australia. This is episode 312 of The Other Side for the weekend commencing Friday, May 10, 2024. I'm Damien Curry, and this is the show that cuts above the noise to dive deeper into the facts of the matter. More data, less hype. A small government adult view of the world, not a government must fix everything for me like a good mummy and daddy childish ABC view of the world. Enjoy the show. An organisation called Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières in French, or RSF as its initials are, puts out an annual press freedom index of the level of media freedom in various countries every year. Now, this is the most respected list of its kind in the world. It won't surprise smart viewers of this show to learn that this year's index, which came out this week, has seen Australia slump to its lowest score ever. We used to always be in the top 20, and now we're barely clinging to the top 40, Australia coming in at 39th. Namibia, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic are all beating us on press freedom. RSF blames the hyper-concentration of media ownership and says newsrooms have suffered in recent years from the negative effects of digital transformation, cost reductions and layoffs, and that is all true. But the most disturbing comment was this one. RSF said Aussies don't fear government restraint or detention, but we still feel threatened by other possibilities such as defamation suits, contempt of court charges, attacks on social media, or loss of employment as a result of government or corporate interference. I'm sorry. What? Australians still feel threatened by other possibilities such as defamation suits, contempt of court charges, attacks on social media, or loss of employment as a result of government or corporate interference. I cannot believe I am reading that about Australia, but it's true. We know it is. Forget all the other crises the media is screaming at you to believe in and worry about. This is number one. We have a free speech crisis in Australia. And if we don't wake up and fix it immediately and push back on government and its misinformation, disinformation bills and its e-safety commissioner, we will not be able to fix any other crises because we have no way to talk about any other crises publicly once we lose our freedom of speech. Freedom starts with the freedom of speech. Americans understand this, and that's why it's in their constitution, and it should be in ours. As someone who was a journalist in the 80s and 90s, I've never in my life felt more afraid of sticking my neck out doing a show like this than I do right now. This country is not safe anymore for people who have a strong opinion that goes against the government grain and who want to express it. And that is not okay. Let's abolish the E-Safety Commission and Commissioner because she and her unit are not keeping us safe from the tyranny of government. They are therefore failing to do their job. And ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, is also failing to do its job in protecting media freedom in this country. I feel I'm putting this show in ADH TV at some risk by criticising ACMA even now. And that should never be the case. I should not feel that way. We should be able to criticise them. So if these organisations are failing as badly as this Reporters Without Borders index proves to keep us all safe from the tyranny of political actors, why do they exist? That's a very good question to ask ourselves. We got a huge reaction last week to our segment exposing the lie that intimate partner homicide in Australia was rising. In case you missed it, we showed the data from the Australian Institute of Criminology, which had just come out. It showed a big and steady decline in intimate partner homicide and acquaintance homicide in Australia since 1989. Homicides are classified by the Australian Institute of Criminology into domestic, meaning an intimate partner, a relative or someone living with you, acquaintance, meaning someone you know who's not living with you, and stranger homicide. And this chart shows all three types and the rates of homicide from 1989 on the left to 2023 on the right. The dark green line is the domestic line and the light green line is the acquaintance line, and they've both dropped massively and consistently since '89. The rate of domestic homicide in 2022-23 was 0.3, and the acquaintance homicide rate decreased to 0.24 per 100,000. That's the lowest since 1989, when it was 2.5 times that. As you can see from the grey line at the bottom, the only type of homicide that hasn't dropped is stranger homicide, and the victims of stranger homicide are significantly mostly men. My ADH TV colleague Daisy Cousens has been a long-time champion of men's rights, as has another internationally popular Aussie YouTuber, Sydney Watson. They got together this week for a chat on Daisy's show, Kaleidoscope.
Did you know that men, not women, are more likely to get attacked in public? Did you know that men are also the majority of murder victims, the majority of the homeless, the majority of the drug and alcohol addicted, and also commit suicide at higher rates than women? Well, with our society's hyper-focus on women's issues as the pinnacle of what warrants compassion, you can be forgiven for not knowing any of the aforementioned statistics.
Yep, you could be forgiven for not knowing any of that if you live in Australia and consume nothing but old media. But there's been an awakening going on for almost a decade now called the Red Pill movement. If you're a Gen Xer like me or a boomer, you may not be aware of the movement called the Red Pill movement. The term is a reference to the Matrix movies and the idea that if you take the red pill, you have woken up and are truly awake to the feminist lie of female oppression in the modern liberal Western world.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
The Matrix. Daisy Cousens and Sydney Watson were big supporters in the early days of the Red Pill movement. But there's a dark side to the movement. Internet grifters and trolls, people who make money and get famous by stirring up trouble, a bit like Australian TV news and current affairs. I'm talking about people like the idiotic former kickboxing champion Andrew Tate, whose screwed up idea of masculinity, that it's all about money and muscles and dominating women, is having almost as damaging an effect on young men as the ratbag feminists telling them that their very essence, their masculinity, is toxic.
I was getting on a plane and I could see through the cockpit that a female was the pilot, and I took a picture and I said, most women I know can't even park a car. Why is a woman flying my plane?
Yeah, that's Andrew Tate. Great. This is not what the Red Pill movement was supposed to be about, but Tate has courses to sell to men about becoming more masculine. And he hooks people in by sometimes speaking the truth to people who need some empathy.
I think most women can actually genuinely understand how lonely the majority of men are. Yeah. And you need to truly understand, if you're Joe Schmo, average in nearly every way, in Starbucks working, you ain't getting a DM ever. You girls will never be lonely. As much as you might be unhappy with the possible suitors, there are men out here in the world who have genuine loneliness.
Now, the thing about Tate is, ask any high school teacher, and they'll tell you that there's a group of boys in their class, small maybe, who are into him at a very impressionable age. That video itself has 10 million views. And it's the more empathetic comments like that that have made Tate popular and his courses successful. We should point out he's facing serious criminal charges in Romania over exploiting women to work on the live porn site OnlyFans. This could be part of a campaign to get at him. We'll find out that in due course. But the point is that his world of old-fashioned sexism is simply not the answer. And it's got commentators like Daisy and Sydney a bit worried about where the red pill movement has gone.
You and I, we came up around the same time in 2018. That's when you were living in Australia. We were both critiquing modern feminism and defending men. You were wonderfully vocal when it came to men's rights. As I mentioned, you organised the March for Men back when the red pill movement was something else entirely. So, Sydney, from your perspective, where did it all go downhill?
When you and I were involved in the conversations around men's rights and men's issues, it was all about highlighting the legitimate problems that men experience as a unique group of people. And now it's kind of become this anti-female, anti-woman-esque movement that's not so much geared around fixing men's problems so much as it is just blaming women for everything.
And Daisy Cousens joins me now. Daisy, thank you for staying back after your show to be with us on the other side. It's great to have you.
Not a problem. Thank you so much for having me. Very glad to be here.
So what struck me about your interview with Sydney Watson was the generation gap. I was thinking, you know, like Gen X and the boomers, my universe, are sort of just becoming red-pilled, and we're saying, hang on a minute, we're sort of realising that what's going on here with the constant demonisation of men in our culture. But you guys are kind of, in Gen Y and Gen Z, seem to be a little bit ahead, and you're on to the next phase of it all, critiquing where the red pill movement is going. Can you just explain for us, Daisy, for us out-of-touch old fuddy-duddies, what we need to know to catch up? What are we missing here?
Well, it's interesting. The red pill movement started out, as all these movements do, as a very, very good movement. It was, as I'm sure you've mentioned, it was named after, Neo taking the red pill in the classic film The Matrix, so his eyes are sort of opened and he sees the world as he really is. And it became really popularized around 2016 when the wonderful Cassie Jaye made that extraordinary documentary about the men's rights movement called The Red Pill. And it's interesting, she was a feminist when she made the documentary, and she made it with the intent of, exposing the men's rights movement as this terrible misogynistic thing. But what she found out was that these men's rights activists, one, were not misogynists, and two, were talking about a whole lot of things that were very, very relevant that were negatively affecting men and boys. I mean, mental health is the obvious one. Men are the majority of the alcohol abusers, the majority of drug addicts, the majority of the homeless. There's a lot of difficulties that men face, just as there are women face. We all have our own kind of sex-based issues that are simply not popularized. And so Cassie came around and finishes the documentary by saying, I no longer call myself a feminist, and she became quite involved actually in trying to promote the men's rights movement and help men. So that red pill movement started as an initiative that was really, really good. And certainly when I became interested in it, I wasn't aware of those issues facing men. And I thought, wow, these feminists, these pop culture feminists really do tell terrible lies about men. And, there's a whole set of data that we just don't see in popular culture. So as all these things do, it started off really good. And I was very happy to talk about it. I spoke at a men's rights conference. Sydney was very involved as well. She organised the March for Men in 2018, the basis of which was, hey, blokes have their own problems and they deserve empathy and compassion and help in exactly the same way that women do. The problem with this is that, as with all movements, there are factions in there that get involved in it and are a little bit unwholesome. So what's happened with the advent of the internet is that certain influencers have joined the movement. The obvious one is Andrew Tate. And then there's podcasts like the Fresh and Fit podcast. There's another one called the Whatever podcast, which sort of flit in that red pill space, but they're much more about hating on women and making fun of women, and also basically telling men not to get married because, you don't want to risk it because you'll end up paying alimony and all of that kind of stuff. That faction was already there in the kind of MGTOW movement, which is men going their own way. But that was a small niche of MGTOW. That was sort of the troll element that I always said were incels pretending to be MGTOW to justify their own lack of sex appeal. That, unfortunately, infiltrated the movement, and we're in a situation where there are a lot of hostile forces on the internet telling young men and also boys, like children and teenagers, that women are something to be avoided and that they're inherently inferior to men. So,
or they're an object, right? It goes back to that really crass sexism of the past that we don't really want to return to. But by the same token, I mean, here we are sort of 8 years, I think, down the track, and have we really come any way in terms of improving things for men? It's still pretty bad. Yet we've got the young guys getting this sort of not so healthy stuff coming at them online. What do you see as the solution here in terms of getting the balance right again?
Oh, well, honesty. I think honesty in commentary. And the thing about this red pill movement, Damien, is that I understand men being resentful of the feminist pop culture that's pushed on them. I mean, men and boys, particularly white men and boys, get told that every single problem in society is their fault, which is, of course, not true. That's a collectivist sort of opportunistic thing that, women who hate men kind of push. I can understand totally the resentment that a lot of men feel. Older guys, I feel like, they're a bit more sure of themselves, and maybe they go, oh, it's just this feminist talking. But think about teenage boys and guys in their early 20s. I mean, what are they supposed to do? They're taught they have to be kind of, tough and manly. At the same time, they're taught that they need to be more emotional. At the same time, they're taught that if they have any kind of sexual desire for a woman, then they're a potential predator and a rapist. I mean, what's a young man to do here? So of course they are attracted to people like Andrew Tate in the absence of any really good male role models. So the solution, I just think that people need to stop lying. Like, feminists need to stop lying, for one thing. They have to stop with this hostility towards men in popular culture. It's ridiculous. It wouldn't be tolerated about any other group of people. Straight white men are the only group in society for which it's politically correct to denigrate them on the basis of race, gender, and sexuality. I mean,
well, comedians are saying now that they're the only group left to attack because they're not allowed to attack any other group, so they don't have material for their comedy, unfortunately. But I mean, do you think that the feminist movement is getting any better? I mean, the days of Clementine Ford, the angry screecher. I mean, you had a famous interaction with her on, I think it was ABC television several years ago. I mean, she is possibly the face of that sort of horrible type of sexist, misandrous kind of feminism that we see now. I don't get a feeling that that's getting a lot better. It seems to be getting a little bit more extreme. What do you reckon on the ground?
Well, the interesting thing is, and it was actually Sydney Watson who put this to me in an interview I did with her on my YouTube channel a while ago, the trans movement has actually cannibalized the feminist movement. So that kind of man-hating, screechy, what I call female-centric feminism, is kind of a thing of the past. So, someone like Clementine Ford, who, made her reputation and her career on, in my opinion, just bashing men, basically, and presenting, data sets that are half-cooked, and,
Awful sexism.
Awful sexism against men. She's kind of she and her ilk are kind of straddling this fence at the moment, which is basically, one, women are oppressed by men, and two, men who identify as women aren't actually men, and because they feel like women, well, they can, of course, come into our spaces and everything. So it's this weird roundabout. So if I believed in patriarchy, I would say it's the patriarchy come full circle. Like, men have found a way around feminism, and that is by identifying as women. You couldn't write it, but there it is. So I think that man-hating feminism still exists, but they're in a very strange place where men, or at least males identifying as women, have actually infiltrated the movement. So I think this fourth wave feminism is due to combust relatively soon, because I think a lot more women now are waking up to the fact that, well, trans women exist. There are males out there who have gender dysphoria living in good faith as women. Like, we don't have any problem with that. But there is this unwholesome element to it, and I think it's really going to drive your average woman away from feminists like Clementine Ford, who are trying to kind of please both sides and will ultimately just end up pleasing no one.
And what do you reckon about the other side of the coin in terms of what will happen to this red pill movement among young men and these negative sort of Andrew Tate type characters? We've seen Jordan Peterson be very critical of Andrew Tate, and rightly so, for all the right reasons. I guess we just need better parenting from both fathers and mothers in terms of guiding kids the right way and keeping that balance right.
I think it's really a matter of parents need to be so involved in their children's internet experience. It's just unbelievable. And that's really hard for parents because the kids are always 4 steps ahead with the technology. You know, you find a way to block their internet, they find a VPN. Like, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. It's very, very hard for parents, but they really do need to be so involved in what their kids, both boys and girls, are consuming on the internet, whether it's, you know, violent pornography that is so pervasive and so easy for them to access, whether it's people like Andrew Tate. He kind of gets around it because he also has a message of, you know, self-improvement for young men, you know, which thing, but he peppers it with this misogyny, outright misogyny. So your parents just like be involved. Surely there are courses you can do online now that teach you how to manage your children's internet experience. My opinion is we should just ban anyone under 18 from being on social media, or better yet, the entire internet. You know, but I know that's not practical. But yeah,
Please don't say that.
ban under 18s from social media. I am perfectly comfortable to say that public. Absolutely, get them off. It's not good for them.
Yeah, it's
But
not healthy.
involved.
I'm fine with that too. I just think that, yeah, we've got to be careful about banning things these days generally with the where the safety commissioner is coming from and all sorts of...
Different for minors though, Damien, you know?
different for minors. Well, hey, that's why it was set up, right? It was set up for children, right?
Yeah.
And it's morphed, as all government things do, into this monster where you know, it's being used as a political tool to censor. Yeah, pretty nuts. We could talk about that for ages too, but we better wrap it up. You've got stuff to do. Thank you very much, Daisy. It's great to have you on the show. I hope you can come back on sometime soon.
Love to. Thank you so much for having me, Damien. This has been great fun.
The British and Swedish pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca, which had one of the very first COVID vaccines on the market, has announced this week that it is withdrawing the vaccine globally because of side effects. The company is facing a class action lawsuit in the UK brought by around 50 people who suffered blood clots and a condition known as TTS. This was the vaccine that Scott Morrison's government decided to buy truckloads of. And you may remember there was a big stoush between the federal government and the Queensland Chief Health Officer when she told people not to take the AstraZeneca because of this very issue. Australia's drug regulator, the TGA, completely discontinued use of the AZ vaccine in April last year. It is not an mRNA vaccine. The TGA gave the vaccine provisional approval for use in Australia for people over 18 years old back in February 2021. And then they backed it again a year later for booster shots. Then the 2 mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, became the main ones recommended, and people shifted away from the AstraZeneca one. ATAGI, the vaccine authority in Australia, told the country back in 2021 that people over 60 should avoid taking the AstraZeneca vax. AstraZeneca's withdrawal was worldwide news this week.
The vaccine can no longer be used in the European Union after the company voluntarily withdrew its marketing authorization. The withdrawal comes months after AstraZeneca admitted a very rare and dangerous side effect causing blood clots and low platelet counts.
Studies showed that about 30 people in a million over the age of 50 would get a fatal blood clot from taking the vaccine, and about 18 in a million under the age of 50 would die. While that's a terrible statistic if you're one of the unlucky ones, it's actually not bad odds compared to a lot of medicines we have to take in emergencies in life. And pro-vaccine people would say that that's a lot better than the odds of dying from COVID. And that's all fine and well and good. All medicine has side effects. All medical decisions are a complex balance of risks. But the issue here is that we had government telling people to get the shots or else they couldn't leave the country or come into the country or see dying relatives interstate or keep their jobs, their livelihoods. And that is just disgusting. That can never be allowed to happen again. You want to weigh up the risks for yourself and take a brand new vaccine that has 1 in 33,000 chance of killing you? Fine. I'm all for your right to choose. But you do not get to tell the rest of us what we must inject into our body. And if you did that at the time to anyone you know, pick up the phone and call them and apologise. Say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Because just as it's wrong for people to shame you for wanting to take that risk and have the vaccine, you should be able to take a reasonably safe vaccine if you choose to. Nobody had the right to tell anyone that they had to take the vaccine. By the way, some of the people on the other side were just as bad, shaming people for taking the vaccine. That's not right either. It's a risk that we get to choose for ourselves whether we want to take. It's the responsibility of the government and the company to inform us fully of the risks as best they know or get sued. But the mandates were simply 100% pure and simple wrong. I've said all along that it's about choice. I personally think Donald Trump did the right thing pushing pharmaceutical companies to deliver a vaccine quickly. I think Operation Warp Speed to get rid of red tape and government obstructions and get vaccines to market fast was good. I think a lot of the work done by pharmaceutical companies to create the vaccines was amazing. Hooray for the profit motive under careful safety regulations. But to then force people to take it by not allowing them free movement or even to go to work if they didn't, that is obscene and must never happen again. Back in September 2021, Scott Morrison told people over 60 to get the AstraZeneca vaccine and not to wait for Pfizer or Moderna. This probably had to do with the fact that he brought a truckload of the stuff and he didn't want it to go to waste, which a lot of it did in the end. And that is exactly why in a free country, the decisions you make in medicine to take or not take a vaccine or drug that has a chance of killing you must be yours and made between you and your doctor, not you and a state bureaucrat or, God forbid, an opportunistic politician. No wonder they didn't want an inquiry. We've been saying for ages on this show that if you can't handle your mortgage repayments at an interest rate level of around 8 to 10%, you should probably talk to a financial planner about maybe selling your house now and downsizing before a real housing price crisis hits and you lose value because you're forced to sell when everyone else is trying to sell and the prices go down. Interest rates are not coming down anytime soon, in my humble opinion. And if they do come down for a couple of rate cycles, it won't be sustained. This is simply because of the economic truth that our governments have been printing money like crazy for the past few years, and that simply must result in inflation. Forget the distraction and the pathetic lie of the Greens and Labor that Coles and Woolies are to blame for inflation. Oh my God, they're not. They make 2.5% profit a year. That is consistent with the world average for supermarkets, and it means there's no price gouging going on. Government overspending and then borrowing and printing money to pay for their gross irresponsibility, that is what causes inflation by definition. And while inflation is high, rates will stay high because central banks like the Australian Federal Reserve and the US Fed, the ones who set the rates, the base rates, will keep those rates high to curb spending and investment, to try to slow the economy down so that inflation doesn't go nuts. The Reserve Bank did not raise the base rate this week, but it didn't lower it either. It kept it steady at 4.35%. This is the base rate that the Reserve Bank lends money to the other banks and that they then lend on to us with a little profit margin in there. This is the fourth time in a row that they haven't put the rate up, despite higher than expected inflation. So the pressure is actually on for them to rise, not to come down at any time soon. At the start of this year, it was forecast by economists all over the world that interest rates would start to come down around about now. But now the experts are saying that we won't see rate cuts from the US Fed until late this year. And what they do, many economies will follow. Who knows if we'll see them in Australia though. In any case, I doubt that even if we do get 0.25% rate cut or 0.5% this year, that it will be sustained. So the cautious thing to do would be to prepare for a high interest rate world in the years ahead. The only way to fix this mess is to shut the Greens and Labor up with their nonsense voodoo economics. Tax the rich bastards. Yeah, right. There aren't that many rich bastards left to tax, guys. And we actually did the math on that in a previous show. And if you taxed all the rich people in Australia, all the billionaires, at 75%, the money you'd raise would not be enough to pay the interest bill on our national debt for 1 year. So you can forget that garbage nonsense from the communists in the Green Party. They don't even know what an economy is, those people, so don't take any advice from them. No, the only way to fix it is to rein in government spending, to tighten our belts, as Bob Hawke used to say back in the day when politicians were at least a little bit smart and responsible. Our Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is going to announce Australia's first budget surplus in 15 years on Tuesday night, and he bloody well should. They took in $750 billion in tax this past year. That's $100 billion more than they usually rake in and that they expected to take in. If he can't balance 1 year's budget with that extra win at the pokies, he's a total loser. All that extra tax revenue came from taxes on commodities and taxes on us. So no brownie points for Chalmers or Elbow, thanks. What we need to look out for is not just a surplus in the budget this week, but an actual cut in the amount of government spending. That windfall that they got shouldn't be spent. It should be used to pay down our crippling national debt that's rising every minute. As a report from the economic boffins at EY, formerly Ernst & Young, says, quote, the Treasurer has promised to bank most of the revenue windfall, but in reality he needs to bank all of it and make tough decisions about existing policy to put Australia's federal budget back on track. But the award for the line of the week goes to opposition Treasury spokesman Angus Taylor, the shadow treasurer, who said, quote, a drover's dog can deliver a budget surplus this year. I love that. So try not to throw up when the Labor kids start slapping themselves on the backs about their budget surplus this coming week. Somebody sent me a video this week and I've got to share it with you. Have a look at this. It's from an organisation called Muslim Votes Matter, which is calling on all Muslims in Australia to all vote the same way.
Welcome to Muslim Votes Matters. As one of the fastest growing minority groups in the country, the Australian Muslim community holds a significant yet largely untapped potential within our national political landscape. We have the power to change things. How? By voting together in a united voting bloc.
Now, it seemed to me that Muslims, like Christians and Jews and atheists, might be very politically diverse. And there'd be lefty Muslims and conservative Muslims. So why would all people want to vote in one homogenous bloc just because of their religion?
As Muslim Votes Matter, we are dedicated to unlocking this enormous community asset. Doing this requires education and awareness, meticulous organisation, forward planning, and effective mobilisation.
Okay, I actually thought this video wasn't real when it was sent to me, so I checked the website. It's all there. You can sign up to support them. Check it out at muslimvotesmatter.com.au. If anyone has any more information about who's behind all this, do send us a direct message on X. We'd love to know more. Voting by religious identification is troubling and dangerously divisive, especially when there's a war on overseas and people want to show solidarity with one side over the other, as we saw in the UK this week. They had city council elections over there and lots of candidates campaigned in predominantly Muslim areas, not on local issues and taking out the garbage, but on the UK's policy towards Gaza and Israel. On the UK's GB News channel, host and politician Nigel Farage had this to say about that.
Well, I've been talking about it for months on this show, the growth of sectarian politics. I said to all of you that George Galloway's win in that Rochdale by-election was not a one-off. Let's have a look at some of the scenes that we witnessed last Thursday night into Friday.
Where is the voice of Palestine? We are coming for you in the general election. Anyone that stands with Zionism, we're coming after you. Free Palestine!
Free Palestine!
Well, anyone that supports Zionism, they are coming to get. I hope that just means in electoral terms, although I'm not, given the tone of that gentleman's manner, entirely sure. And let's see some of the scenes of celebration. There were about 40 council seats won by people standing on a Gaza agenda. Some stood for the Green Party, some stood for Galloway, some stood as independence. And this all took place in areas that are Muslim majority wards. If that's not a sectarian vote, I don't know what is. How many women can you see in that picture? Absolutely none.
Nigel Farage there on GB News. He points out the organisation Muslim Votes is also active in the United Kingdom, as it seems to be here, based on that video I just showed you. I'm assuming that the two are linked somehow, but I could be wrong. Now, 2023 migration to Australia was more than 750,000 people, 765,900 to be precise, a record level and a massive level of migrants for a country of only 27 million people. It's 3% of the population, which is the same percentage as the entire Indigenous population of Australia. And that was just last year. A country like Australia, if it has a strong core culture and values and legal guidelines clearly defined, can tolerate subcultures of citizens with different views without falling apart. But it can't tolerate subcultures of citizens with totally different worldviews unless those citizens work to assimilate and conform to some extent and accept that they won't be able to have their views fully realised within the new host culture. Islam is a culture that is rich and strong, and it has a very different history to ours. There are plenty of similarities, but there are also striking differences. So, too, those raised in communist countries might have a bigger challenge assimilating to Australian free market liberal society. To require immigrants from really different cultures to assimilate is not racist. My ancestors came from other places in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They assimilated. They came here because they wanted to adopt this Australian Anglo-Celtic Christian-based culture. They wanted the Western classical liberal way of life and the opportunity and freedom that it embodies. Voting by religion, sectarian politics, is not demonstrating respect for the host culture and a healthy willingness to assimilate. It's divisive and separatist. And as Farage points out, the UK has also had massive immigration as a percentage of population.
And what you can see is that if people come in very, very large numbers, they bring their culture with them. And what we're witnessing with this growth of sectarian politics is an attempt to take over councils, is an attempt to win seats in the British Parliament. And over the last couple of days, the organisation called Muslim Vote, that we've highlighted here on this show before, have put out 18 demands to Keir Starmer. Things such as he must ensure that Sharia-compliant pensions are available at every workplace.
Nigel Farage on GB News. Of the 25 mayors in England, 9 are now Muslim. The mayors of London, Birmingham, Leeds, Blackburn, Sheffield, Oxford, Luton, Rochdale and Oldham. And before Australia's media police, Karen and ACMA, come down on me like a ton of bricks, further demonstrating our loss of press freedom here, let me stress there is nothing wrong with that, so long as those mayors are there to represent all of their constituents' interests and not merely to push agendas specific to their religious beliefs and their religious community. But it raises some questions, especially in light of Muslim Votes Matters activity here in Australia. Whoever is behind it, it is well resourced, and they know what they are doing.
There are 151 seats in the House of Representatives. Each circle shown represents a single seat. A party needs a majority, or 76 seats, to form a government. In the last election, the Labour Party secured a government with a slim majority of just 1 seat. This highlights how every single vote can tip the balance of power at the upcoming election. Based on the margins of the last 2 elections, there are currently 18 seats where the Muslim voting population is greater than the margin by which these seats are held. In these seats, our community has the potential to decide the outcome. And with some support from allied groups, or as part of a broader swing vote, this number would be well over 20 seats. Doesn't sound like much? Well, consider this. At the last election, the government's majority was just 1 seat. At the election before that, the government's majority was also just one seat. And, you guessed it, the election before that was also just one seat. In fact, in the last 25 years, no government has had a majority of more than 15 seats.
Sounds very English, that voiceover, doesn't it? That's from MuslimVotesMatters.com.au. Our next guest is one of Australia's leading expert commentators on housing, and he's got a plan to fix our so-called housing crisis, which he says is actually only affecting a small proportion of Aussies and can be dealt with quite easily. Dr. Cameron Murray is an economist and founder of the think tank Fresh Economic Thinking. He says that the housing policy debate has been hijacked by interest groups, and he says we're sailing further away from workable solutions rather than towards them. He's written a book about it called The Great Housing Hijack, the hoaxes and myths that are keeping prices high for renters and buyers in Australia. Cameron Murray joined me for an in-studio interview, which we pre-recorded earlier in the week. Cameron, thanks very much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me, Damien.
So you've got an interesting thesis here. Let's define the problem firstly as you see it. You say that there's hoaxes and myths going on, that vested interests are pulling the strings in the property market. Who are these vested interests and why are they pulling the strings?
Yeah, to be clear, in the housing debate, I'm arguing the debate is hijacked, and that's because certain interest groups have an interest in keeping property prices and rents high. Every property owner, every landlord, they love higher rents and they love higher prices. But on the flip side, the cost to that is the higher rents paid by, mum and dad renters, we could call them. And so I think the way we structure our debate is that we sort of forget the flip side. We forget that there's a cost to every benefit for renters, and every cost to a renter is a benefit from a landlord. And I think if we can acknowledge that, we can move on the debate on. Whereas what we're doing is we're sort of avoiding that. We're sort of avoiding that taboo, I call it, issue in housing, that a benefit for a renter is a cost for a landlord. And if we can't navigate this issue, we'll keep going round in circles in what I call the hijacked housing debate.
Okay, so nobody's to blame, right? It's just the reality of the situation.
Reality. Yeah. Well, I mean, think about it. We've got 2/3 of households are property owners, 18% of households are landlords. Just about every politician, maybe bar one, at the state and federal level is a landlord of some sort. And of course, they have interests financially in supporting, high prices in the property market and avoiding taxing property and things like that. And so when you have that situation, it's only the natural outcome to, how would I put it, signal your concern for renters by saying, yeah, we care about affordable housing, but in reality not wanting to devalue your biggest assets.
Right.
And that's the tension we're facing, and that's the thing we can't push through in the public debate, that affordable housing means cheap housing, means people who own property are going to bear the cost of that.
So just to get this right, Cameron, you're basically saying that if there wasn't government intervention to keep prices going up, then we would have, or at least maintain, or favourable policy for the prices, that we'd see an asset price correction.
Not specifically. Look, we had a long history prior to what we'd call government intervention in taxes and regulation in housing, right? All through the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s, and do you know what we had? Very expensive housing. My favourite quote comes from Charles Darwin in 1836, right? He visited Sydney on the HMS Beagle.
The Charles Darwin.
The Charles Darwin, father of evolutionary theory, and his diary entry on his first day says, "The number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house."
Okay.
So what I'm sort of getting at is this is a more natural outcome of markets, but we did have a period, a post-World War period from the 50s and 60s where we had intervention to help solve housing. We actually got home ownership up from around 43% in the metropolitan areas to 71% in 2 decades after the war. And we did that by subsidising people into home ownership. I mean, Menzies was famously pushing for little capitalists.
Yep.
So he didn't see it as socialism of subsidising people into homes.
Yep.
He saw it as, well, I'm creating more capitalists, but the cost of getting that is subsidising people into homes.
Of government intervention. And
correct.
I mean, purist libertarians watching the show might not like this, but the reality is, and most of our classical liberal viewers would admit, you've got to have some government intervention sometimes to push things along or get things started. And, housing is something that I suppose, it's obviously got that social component more strongly than a lot of other markets. And so we've got to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, can you just summarise for me what the cause is? I mean, the situation we've got now is high prices.
Well,
everybody's saying it's just a market gone crazy. It's foreign money coming in. What's really going on?
Well, I think we need to zoom out a little. We've got the same situation happening in Canada, the US, Europe, across Asia, in New Zealand, and every city I go to, I get people come up to me and they say, Cameron, we're the worst for this, aren't we? Our housing market's the worst. And I said, well, you know what's funny? Every city I go to, people think that. So I think we're dealing with a normal outcome of property markets where during a boom period, prices and rents rise rapidly, but that process leaves people behind. And what we're not doing is working on non-market ways to support those people who are getting left behind. And that's only a small portion of the population, right? When I go on my book tours, I get people to put their hand up in the audience. I say, who are the homeowners here? Put your hands up. Keep them up if you're having a housing crisis. They all put their hands down. I'm like, okay, so we've got all this talk about a housing crisis. Get the renters to put their hand up. Who's having a housing crisis? Most of them put their hand down too. I'm like, okay, so we're actually only dealing maybe 10% of the households who are having a crisis.
Right.
Why can't we just directly support them?
It's another one of these media beat up crises, right? Or just a community hysteria.
Yeah, well, one of the points I make in the book is when prices are rising, it's a crisis for people who don't own houses, but a boom for those who do. Prices are falling, it's a crisis for those who own houses, but a boom for those who don't because they get in cheap.
Are asset prices inflated though? Are housing prices in the residential markets in Australia in need of correction?
It's a little bit more subtle than that actually, Damien, because if we go back 2 years when interest rates were 2%, asset prices in housing make a lot of sense at 2%. But what we've actually tried to do, and we overlook this fact, is we manage the macroeconomy through housing. We've put interest rates up to make it more difficult to buy a home. That was the intended outcome. Make it more difficult to build a home. And now we're getting that outcome and everyone's saying, no, this is terrible.
The outcome we look for.
So we need to always zoom out and think about the long-term context. And that's true also when we think about what policies we want to do to change the outcome. We need to think about more long-term, what's worked elsewhere, what's worked in the past, and acknowledge that the market's going to do its boom and bust cycles and we're going to be in this situation again. This situation today reminds me a lot of the late 2000s, from 2006 to 2008. Rents were rising rapidly, interest rates were rising. We're all complaining about housing. And then in the early 2010s, housing was quite reasonably affordable in most cities.
Now, in a recent interview you did on the Discernible platform with Matt Wong, Matt mentioned about a $9 million house that was sold in Sydney in the inner suburbs. I mean, are you saying that that's the market? I mean, that's the reality. If someone's going to pay that much, that's what the house is worth.
Well, this is the thing. Do we like the market outcome or do we not, right? Because the seller of that house likes the market outcome. And I think it's reasonable. Like, we do need that flexibility in the housing system. We need people to speculate on it. We need people to fail and go bust if they pay $9 million and it's worth $5 million in 5 years' time. But not everyone can participate and put that money at risk. We still need places to live. We need security of those places. We don't want to have to be squeezed out. And I think this is where the heart of the problem is. It's not that housing's expensive or cheap. It's that some people, when prices rise, can't keep up with everyone else.
Okay, and you're saying
they're getting squeezed, they have to move, they're becoming homeless. That is the issue we need to address, and we need to sidestep the market outcome to help that, because the market's not going to solve that problem by itself.
So your solution's quite interesting, because you're saying that's affecting about 10% of people. You're basically saying we need to split the social problem from the free market. Take the free market 90% and leave it alone. Take the 10% and take care of them, like the safety net.
Yeah, now you're getting it, because a lot of the conversation
I'm slow,
we're
but
having.
I eventually get there.
You're telling me. I love hearing people tell me the conclusion I came to, and I'm like, yes.
Excellent. That's my job. Just to summarise it.
Yeah, we've got this debate where we're trying to engineer, low rents and prices for 11 million dwellings in the market. We don't need to do that. We only need to get around 1 million dwellings and offer them to people outside the market, right? To offer that security to that small part of the whole population who gets really badly affected when prices and rents change rapidly.
Okay. So how do we do that in a way that, would sort of be respectful of the market and not distort or pervert the market in any way? Well, not that we're not distorting it or perverting it at the moment, but I mean, how would we do that?
Yeah, so a lot of what we talk about is, should we tax property more? Should we give grants for this? Should we change the way we lend money? These are all sort of good questions, but we have the same housing problem in, for example, New Zealand, that doesn't have stamp duty on property trades. And we have the same property problems in Europe and the United States that have very different regulations on property. So we can talk about that, but fundamentally, this problem of people left behind when the market booms, that's still happening everywhere. The places it doesn't happen are those that either have very, very high home ownership, right? Because home ownership insulates you from, you don't have to pay more rent if the rent goes up. I actually say home ownership is the greatest form of rent control, because your landlord never puts your rent up, right? And so historically in Australia, one way we did it is we subsidised people into home ownership. We had state governments very, very active in housing development, and the federal government very active in subsidising mortgages, and that's how we got that extra 20% of people into home ownership. I look at places like Singapore that got home ownership from 20% to 88% in 3 decades, right? By subsidising people into home ownership.
That was very state-controlled, top-down,
It's very state-controlled
system, right? For Singapore, I mean, it's a...
Yeah, it is.
It's a socialist country with a capitalist overlay, right?
Well, all countries are like that to some degree, right? We've just got to pick and choose where we let the market flourish and take those outcomes, and where we want to intervene. That's, I think, the political judgment. And we do that everywhere. So, and Australia, got high home ownership by subsidising it. So I think one way to do it is what I call housemate, which is essentially a public home ownership option. So renters can essentially get a subsidised home, but instead of like a first homeowners grant, giving them the cash and they can turn around and sell it at the market price, you make them resell back into the system of other qualifying buyers. So that sort of keeps this parallel subsidised system at a lower price. And people who aren't satisfied with the market, which is not that many people when we really think about what the issue is, can shift out. It's like a relief valve, a pressure relief valve for the market.
So the problem with first home buyer grants and tax policies and things like those sorts of interventions across the whole market is that you get these market distortions and perversions, and eventually it just builds into the cost. And if you know that they can pay $7,000 more because the government's given it, and the price goes up $7,000, so it's kind of all cancelled out. But what you're saying is we need to create a separate market, if you like, that you can only sell back into that social market, that safety net market of that 10%.
Correct. And you build that up over 10 or 15 years. And then next time we're having this booming rents like we're having right now, instead of 30% of households having to outbid each other and pay the higher rent, maybe we're down to 15% of households. And they're the more mobile, high-income households, not those ones that just want to stay put where they are and pay a steady rent because their kids are at school. Well, they'll have the option to get out into something more stable and secure. So when I look around the world, those types of broad social housing options are what keeps working class people in the cities during boom times. And I'm a bit agnostic on how you operate it. I want the most efficient, simplest administration possible. But if I just can't see any other way of helping those people. And
we can't have people living in cars in a country this wealthy. We've got to fix that problem. And
that's right.
This might be the way to do it without messing with the free market too much.
That's right. And I think it's a dead end to have a political debate about, we're going to fix housing by crushing everyone's house prices or all this sort of stuff. Well, let's think that through a little bit more, right?
There's no incentive.
This is the hijacked housing debate. We go around in circles. You know, we've used those higher incomes that we've got. We've had inflation, so everyone, cost of everything's gone up. The household incomes have gone up, and housing's one dimension. And the problem, of course, again, happening globally, a lot of people's incomes haven't kept up with others. And now they're getting outbid for their locations, and they're getting squeezed out of the cities or squeezed into tents and, sleeping on the couch at the relatives.
Yeah. Cameron, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Great to talk to you. And the book, just remind us once again, The Great
Housing Hijack. It's available everywhere, all good bookstores.
We've got it up on screen now. Also available as an ebook, no doubt.
Of course.
All right. The Great Housing Hijack. And if people want to get in touch with you have a website?
FreshEconomicThinking.com is my website. You can subscribe for free and follow all my writing about housing and all other economic topics.
Great. Okay, so we need a two-tiered system, a social system for the 10%, and leave perhaps less market intervention for the other 90%, and that should work okay.
Yeah, I think next cycle, when we look back, we'll say, this is much better than what happened last time in terms of housing.
All right. Thanks very much for your time, Cameron. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Damien.
And that is all we have time for this week on The Other Side. Please remember to follow us on Twitter X and YouTube at Other Side Oz. That's at Other Side AUS. They're our two main social media platforms. We're no longer on Meta's Facebook or Instagram. We can't trust them. And please smash the old like and subscribe and every other button on the platforms that you possibly can, and make comments. All of that helps with the magical algorithms that we have to fight with that control us all. Of course, the very best place to join us is right here on our independent platform, ADH TV, at adh.tv. All you have to do is go onto any web browser, and it is absolutely free to sign up, and you get all the other great ADH TV shows as well. We'll catch you next weekend for The Other Side. We drop a new show every Friday night at 8 p.m. I'm Damien Curry. Bye for now.